So welcome everyone to this Euronews Africa News debate centered around the EU-Africa Summit, which is happening as we speak. There are more than 40 African leaders and all 27 EU leaders joining together in Brussels as we speak. I am here at the European Parliament in Strasbourg. In fact, I've been talking to a number of members of the European Parliament about how they would like to see more of a two-way street, more of a partnership. The title of this debate is the South Africa perspective. Can the EU and Africa reboot their relationship as President Macron of France, holding the presidency of the EU, would like to see? He'd like to see an overhaul of Europe and African relations. He wants to see an evolving partnership tackling development, the green transition, the digital transition. It's a crucial decade ahead. How do we make this work? And what about South Africa? South Africa, what about the most industrialized economy on the continent, and that it's a leading economic driver, but there's high unemployment, there's poverty, it needs more investment. Interesting that we saw more than $4 billion in investment in Africa startups, and we could see up to $5 billion or more this year. So it is growing. There are positive stories coming out, but a lot of things to tackle, and of course, COVID and the aftermath. Now, let me introduce you to the guests. Swazi Chabalala, Vice President of the African Development Bank Group based in Ivory Coast. Welcome, Swazi. Dr. Carlos Lopez, African Development Economist from Guinea-Bissau and Honorary Professor at the Nelson Mandela School of Governance at the University of Cape Town. You're also former Executive Secretary of the UN Economic Commission for Africa. Colin Coleman, co-chairman of the South Africa's Youth Employment Service, former CEO of Goldman Sachs in Sub-Saharan Africa, former senior fellow and lecturer at Yale University, and your family was a family of anti-apartheid activists. Very interesting past. And Rona Gopaldas, director of Signal Risk, business intelligence agency. Signal Room, you have a Signal Room. It's a daily analysis of major developments in Africa for top companies and SMEs. In Brussels is Luisa Santos, who's head of the International Relations at Business Europe, which represents 40 national industry and employers organizations. You've lived in Mozambique in your younger days. And in Domenica Rosa, also in Brussels, head of the task force on post-Cotonou EU-Africa ties. Cotonou was that agreement on partnership, and the effort is to make that evolve. He's over at the DG International Partnerships at the European Commission. And there's you, all of you listening, and I'd like to get you involved in sending in your questions. We've received a few already, and would like to fit that in to these 60 minutes that we're going to be talking. So we're going to try to keep it as quick moving as possible. A couple of technical tips: those questions you can send through the YouTube chat. And keep in mind, if you hear a good soundbite, like to make a good comment, there are a few hashtags to think about: hashtag EU-AU Summit, hashtag Africa News Debates, hashtag Euronews Debates. I might have mentioned too that myself, I've been on the ground in Africa as a journalist, covering both conflicts, but also a lot of hopeful signs about startups, about innovation, and how there is a great potential across Africa for that. Let's start with Swazi Chabalala of the African Development Bank. Swazi, give me a couple of your expectations from this summit. I mean, it's interesting that there are going to be roundtable groups based on themes like cybersecurity, counterterrorism, inclusive growth, health, and vaccinations. It looks like they're really getting down, talking nuts and bolts, practical solutions, as opposed to a lot of grand speeches, as we've seen so many times during these summits. Swazi.
Thank you very much, Chris, and thank you for the opportunity to participate today. And indeed, the focus is on the brass tacks. I think it's necessary because the ambitions are big. I was reviewing, some of these ambitions in what they're calling the Global Gateway Investment Package for Africa.
And that package is, I might just jump in, that package is aimed at mobilizing 300 billion euros in investment across the world, and half of that in Africa. public and
Exactly,
private.
exactly. In fact, 150 billion for
Yep.
Africa, with targets for 2030, which is just around the corner. So in my view, I think that we need to be talking about how we do that, who does that with the European Union. And I am here obviously as a South African, but also as a representative of the African Development Bank, a development institution. So in fact, the president of the bank is participating in the summit. And what we hope to come out of there with is firm commitments from both Team Europe, and we've been having discussions with Team Europe
Okay.
and the African Development Bank on how we mobilize these resources for accelerating, at this point, accelerating Africa's development, because 2030 is not far away.
No, it's not. And it's a crucial decade. Carlos Lopez, economist in South Africa, in Cape Town. Carlos, welcome. I've heard you saying that this summit, as others in the past, I think this is number 6, right? Risks producing nothing more than grand declarations of intent that have little substance. You told that to Le Monde. What concrete substance do you want to see?
Well, in fact, this is a good occasion to structure the partnership, and a lot of engagements that have taken place over the last 2 years were aimed at structuring the partnership. And we hope one of the outcomes of the summit is going to be some instrument that will allow for mutual accountability on some of the things that each other promises the other.
Like?
But
Yep.
like, for instance, the fact that we have 4 priority areas in Africa that have been identified by the African Union: peace and security, migration, trade, and climate change. And when you look into the program of the summit, you see that these 4 priorities have been blurred in a number of roundtables that basically go all over the place, but don't touch the very difficult questions.
What about vaccinations? I think I believe that's one of the things you would like to see. And this is what Macron has suggested. He wants to see a global license for a vaccine technology against COVID. I mean, I guess we could at least say a declaration of intent on that, right?
Well, declarations of intent, we have many. You know, each time that there is a summit, just prior to the summit, there are proclamations of all kinds. The last one being the Global Gateway. The last summit, it was the Juncker Plan. And what happens is that until the next summit, we forget that we had already so many pledges that didn't actually materialize. And on vaccines, it's the same thing. You know, there was a mechanism called COVAX that was established or is established with the intent of trying to provide vaccines to the poorer countries. And in fact, we are way below the expectations, and we are not really commensurate to the solidarity that has been mentioned at the beginning of the process. So intent, we have plenty.
Yeah, intent. Colin Coleman, South African Youth Employment Services. What do you hope to see in terms of addressing youth concerns? That there's a youth population explosion coming up in these next few years across Africa, including in South Africa. What would you like to see from this summit in addressing that?
Well, I think it's important to highlight what's at stake, particularly for the European Union, because everybody will think it's good for Africa to have fast-track development, as Fuzzy, my friend in Addis Ababa, was talking about. But the question is, what's in it for the European Union? And the important thing to focus in on is by the beginning of the 22nd century, in 80 years' time, 2 in 5 people in the world will be African, according to population statistics, reliable population statistics.
Right.
In other words, it's the fastest growing population in the world. And yet Africa starts only with 3% of the world's GDP. Today, 17% of the world's population. So if it's 40% of the world's population at the end of this century, we have to grow the economic share very significantly. And that's the heart of what's in it for the youth. The youth is the bulging population.
Yeah.
And we need to have Europe focus on the fact that it will be the biggest frontier of global growth in the world if we're even half successful with growth in Africa as a whole. but it'll also be one of the largest threats to the world's peace. Export of terrorism, export of migration, and guess who will get the migration? It's not going to be the United States or China. It's going to be straight into the corridors, the seas, and the lands of Europe. And that will fundamentally affect the politics of Europe, including President Macron's France, where he's standing for re-election. So I think it is critical that in order to avoid an explosion of populism and nationalism in Europe, that we begin to address Africa's economic development so that its economy rises with its population share, and in fact has to accelerate because it's already got a very significant difference. So for the reforms for youth, we need to see economic growth in the main engine rooms of Africa.
With help from the European Union and others. Let me move to Ronak Gopaldas at Signal Risk. We're already talking about risk here. And you and I talked earlier about this, that you've told me it's a big, tough challenge. Africa needs help for this because they must democratize, industrialize. They got to get green at the same time. They got to create hundreds of millions of jobs. What is at stake for you here, and how big is this risk, and how big is the opportunity?
I mean, so Chris, there's a lot at stake, obviously, but there's also a big elephant in the room that we need to acknowledge. And going into the summit, I think the fact is that there's a lot of African anger and resentment at the way that they've been treated over the past couple of years, from the vaccine hoarding to the lack of the waiver on the intellectual property rights for local manufacturing.
No, the flight ban against South Africa after they uncovered Omicron.
Well, exactly, which was not rooted in science or data, as well as the lack of commitment towards green finance, because Africa is being asked to do stuff that no other continent in the world has done. So I think, that's the elephant in the room. And, out of this summit, I want to see a few things. So first of all, from the European perspective, there needs to be a real sincere effort to limit some of this damage, because, there's this resentment. And you know what, we see these summits all the time. There's rhetoric that doesn't match the reality. There's bells and whistles. There's all these announcements.
That's the big risk of these summits. We've got to see something concrete this time, don't we?
Yeah, so that needs to happen, and then we need to recalibrate to something far more equal. And this is where something like the reallocation of the SDRs, the IMF SDRs,
special
African
drawing rights,
like the African Development Bank, are going to be important. And from the African perspective, I think negotiating as a collective bloc is going to be important. I think what we want to see really is the message coming across to the Europeans that there are other development partners. We've had FOCAC last year, which illustrated the depth and the breadth of China's influence in Africa. The Japanese and the Indians through the Asia Growth Corridor are doing the same thing, the Turks, the Russians. And so there are options. So I think African agency becomes a big theme going into this summit, and negotiating as a collective bloc. But I think, we know about the pomp, the pageantry, the ceremony, but we want to see some real tangible lasting outcomes coming out of this.
Indeed. Luisa Santos of Business Europe over there in Brussels. Now, I know you sent a letter to Madame von der Leyen, the President of the European Commission, telling her you'd like to see economic partnership agreements as drivers of change. You'd like to see flexible financing instruments so that business could get involved in investing. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and what you would like to see in that regard to get the private sector more involved in creating capital and wealth and jobs in Africa?
Thanks, Chris, and good afternoon to everyone. I think what we are aiming at is to have more a partnership of equals. I think this is in the interest of Africa as it is in the interest of the European Union. And of course, this starts also with the private sector. There is a strong willingness from the part of the European private sector to invest more in Africa, to do more joint ventures with local business. And this is happening already, and it's been happening already. We have a lot of problems of market integration and fragmentation in Africa, together with other issues that have an impact on cost and risk. So I think we need to work definitely on a serious way and how to reduce these costs, because they are making, of course, investments, especially for smaller companies, more difficult. And I think here it's also important that we empower a bit more the private sector in Africa.
How do you do that?
They are more at the table, that
Yeah.
they have a real role in defining the public policies in Africa, as we have as well here in Europe. This is very important if we want to step up our partnership and take it to the next level.
How much do you think that the global gateway that we were talking about, trying to mobilize 150 billion euros in public and private investment, how much hope do you have for that in terms of sharing risk and minimizing or lowering the amount of risk involved in making an investment in Africa?
Well, we are, as a starting point, very positive about the initiative because the principles behind it are the right ones. The principle of transparency, the principle of inclusiveness. We want to work with local operators. Of course, again, the framework conditions will be critical, and this means that we will need a conducive business environment. For instance, reduction of trade barriers, elimination of duties. That's why the Continental Free Trade Agreement is a project that we think it could be really fundamental to bring a new model of growth for Africa. And it would definitely help also to attract more European business and more companies, especially SMEs, to Africa. So it's a conducive business environment. If we manage to make all these new proposals that are on the table a reality, but not see them individually, see them together, working together with a strong emphasis on the cooperation between the public sector and the private sector, both in Europe and in Africa.
Domenico Rosa, over at the European Commission, I wanted to ask you about this because that free trade agreement that Luisa just mentioned, it's been in effect for about a year. How much can this summit help to maybe accelerate it and make it work better? I mean, after all, the EU is a model of open free trade within its borders. Perhaps the EU can help in Africa to make that free trade area happen better as well. Domenico.
No, well, thank you very much for this question. First of all, I think that the Africa Continental Free Trade Areas or Agreement is a really African project. So I think that in a way or another, we as the Europe, we should try to interfere, not to interfere at all, if I may say, and just to provide support when support is requested. Of course, we have, I would say, huge experience that we can exchange. Indeed. And we also provided in the past, so far we managed to mobilize 70 million euro to support the establishment of the continental free trade areas. But of course, I think that everything that we can support should come from a request from the African side. Otherwise, I think that we will, I would say, follow in the same logic of donor, recipient, and so on, where Europe is seen as you would like to impose standards and methods. I think that what we did in our internal market is something valuable. Europe is an area of peace and prosperity since we established the common market. I would say I wasn't born at the time, and I think that is an example. But then, of course, there could be an African solution to these continental free trade areas. So I think that we have to see the continental free trade areas as a purely internal African project. Then what could be the consequence and the relation in the trade flows between the continents is another matter that will take place, this debate, at a later stage. And of course, everything we are doing now and in the future in terms of trade agreement between Europe and Africa should take into consideration that this is the Africa project, and we shouldn't in a way damage this project.
Okay, but let's move on back to the summit and the idea of an overhaul of the relationship. You being head of that team dealing with post-Cotonou, after the post-Cotonou agreement, bringing some kind of evolution in this exchange, this partnership between the EU and Africa. What would you like to see from this summit?
Well, I think that the idea is to renew a little bit the partnership, to renew the partnership in the sense that I think that we have now all in place to make this renewal happen. You mentioned the global gateway. We are at the beginning of the multi-annual financial framework, where in the new instrument for development and cooperation, we have allocated 80 billion euro to Africa. So I think
that's
that
over 7 years. That's a 7-year budget framework.
Of course, yes, but I think that is important that because this could be seen as a seeds fund in order to push for this Team Europe initiative that we had to put in place during the pandemics when our funds were exhausted because we were in the previous financial framework. I think that we proved to be responsive to African requests. Of course, there is the question of vaccine that was a problem for everybody, and I think that now solidarity starts moving ahead. There is the promise to deliver 450 million doses by this summer. That I suppose is definitely something that is noticeable. Then I think that there is this question of the vaccine availability. Vaccine availability is one problem, but then there is all the problem on how the vaccine are distributed and administered, and not all the African countries are in a situation where this vaccination campaign can take place in an effective way. I understand from latest news that there are, for instance, 15 million doses that cannot be distributed because the system is not able to.
So there needs to be more help in that regard as well. I thought it interesting to see that the head of the WHO was in South Africa to attend to go and see this new vaccine production. That's the first vaccine production in Africa. How can the EU help to promote that? And what do you think about Mr. Macron's suggestion that there be a global license for vaccines? I know there is, that the EU 27 are not all on the same page on that.
No, well, on the vaccine production in Africa, I think that we are aware, and I think that we would like to promote the African autonomy in terms of vaccine production, but not only vaccine, but all, I would say, other medical countermeasures in case of new pandemics or epidemics. And there is this commitment to put in place 1 billion euro to have 3 hubs of production of vaccine, one in South Africa, by the way, that is the country that is up to deliver on this. The second one is in Senegal, and the third one is in Rwanda. I think that already the initiative started to produce, not produce, but at least the project, that it is a big project, it start moving. So I think that this is a clear or concrete deliver. Then there was all this question of the TRIPS waiver and so on. And if I refer to the previous discussion, TRIPS waivers, it was not just the solution for. I think that the vaccination is a problem that is much more complex than just vaccine production, and moreover, because the waiver wouldn't triggered the production of the vaccine immediately.
Okay. All right.
So on Macron ideas, well, who am I for opinate?
Yeah. Okay. Well, let me move on then. Let's get to a couple of questions from the audience, and audience, for those of you watching, please do keep in mind you can put in your questions through the YouTube chat. Here's one. What about eliminating the CFA, the central, the French, what do you say? CFA is the currency in West Africa. Why should France exert such economic control over their former colonies? Who would like to comment on that? Perhaps Swazi, would you like to talk about that? Because you're in that area. You're from that area.
Yes, I live in Abidjan, and I use the CFA to purchase goods. But I think we must be careful not to overstate, certain things, and I think, efforts are already underway, within ECOWAS to talk about, first of all, how they accelerate their economic integration. Obviously, ECOWAS is made up of CFA countries. It's also made up of countries like Nigeria and Ghana, which have their own currencies. So this is something of importance for them, and I think that they're working on it. But what I want to focus on is actually to build a little bit on the discussion on economic integration, because what we're talking about here fundamentally is how do we accelerate Africa's development. And we have foundations. I think over the last 20 and 30 years, there's been very good foundations built. If you're looking at the regional economic committees, that have been set up throughout the continent, a lot of work has been done by them to try and integrate the economies. And the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat, which, by the way, we also fund as the African Development Bank, is working with these regional groupings, to see how we go from regional integration to continental integration. But the point I really want to make is that this integration will remain a pipe dream if you do not have the investment in infrastructure that actually makes it possible for these countries to trade with one another and to enhance global trade, with Africa. So it's really, really important, I think, that we focus on, the substantial, the gap required for investment in infrastructure in Africa is enormous and growing. So it really should be the focus of how do we mobilize these resources? How do we mobilize the private sector? How do we de-risk to make it possible for the private sector to participate in PPP projects? We have a number of these flagship projects. I think the most famous one is probably and most ambitious is the Desert to Power project, in the Sahel, 11 gigawatts of power that we are aiming to put in that region. Because in fact, if you're talking about security, if you're talking about the youth bulge that Colin was talking about, if you're talking about migration, in fact, without energy, and over 600 million Africans don't have access to power, don't have access to energy. If you don't address those issues, I think everything else is very, very difficult.
And that's very much that, even though South Africa is very industrialized, it does have an issue about energy, doesn't it, Colin? You there, Colin?
Obviously a major issue, Chris. I just wanted to make a couple of points in reaction to some of our colleagues from the European Union in particular. I think, what we don't want this the summit to leave us feeling like is like we've had an anesthetic, that anesthetic, don't worry about things, go to sleep, everything's going to be fine, we'll take care of you. What we want is a turbocharge, a release of that energy between Europe and Africa. Let's be clear. Europe is not going to solve Africa's problems alone. It's going to need Africa, but it's also going to need the United States and China. In other words, the world's superpowers to cooperate and collaborate together. So what I would like to see is Europe thinking about and resolving how does it cooperate with China that has a very deep, broad and well-financed program for Africa, and the United States that has very large amounts of investment and aid and trade, perhaps being outpaced by China itself. But how do you collaborate rather than compete between these world powers around Africa? That's number one.
Indeed, because
number two is what do we want to actually focus on? We want to focus on, firstly, mobilizing real security, meaning troops, personnel, skills, intelligence to combat Islamic fundamentalism. We want to mobilize a real response to vaccination on the continent. Without it, we won't have economic development. We want to focus on what skills development can Europe unleash for the purposes of developing capacity in African governments to respond. We want to get the European Unions, the presidents of Germany, of France, of Italy, of the United Kingdom, of everyone, to say, how do we get our multinational companies to engage more in the opportunities? How do we showcase the opportunities for trade and investment? And then finally, the aid programs. How do we target the aid programs in a way that is going to unlock problems of food famine, problems of social development in these countries? And also, we want the European Union to not stand by idly. It's one thing to collaborate. It's also important for them to punish wrongdoing in African countries and to stand up and shame wrongdoing if they occur and reward good practice. So I think we need to see some very specific things. I think to say, you know, these things are for Africans to work out is just inviting you know, an armchair anesthetic for those in the continent.
No, Carlos, let me tap your brain a bit on this too, and about the government wrongdoing, and about what about these coups that we saw in West Africa recently, and that Macron intends to pull out his force in Mali. What kind of message does that send on the security side? What needs to be done about that?
Well, when you look into the peace and security dimension of the relationship, you will have to realize that what we have had until now was a very strong support from the European Union to the African peace and security architecture, which is a tool of the African Union. Mm-hmm. And now there is a decision, because of the budgetary changes that have occurred in the EU, of pulling from a joint governance of that support system and taking the decisions unilaterally under the umbrella of a European security strategy. The implications, politically speaking, are quite far-reaching, because the less the African Union is involved in the process, the less legitimacy you have. Therefore, you know, the interventions from Europeans in peace and security matters are going to be perceived by many, with or without reason, as being foreign to a system of decision that is African-owned. That's why you will have the reactions against the French in Mali and a number of other reactions of other types of interventions. And that's why Africa is more and more being used as a terrain for proxy confrontation between different military interests. You know, you have even the Emiratis supporting, for instance, one of the sides in Ethiopia. You have Turkish, you have Qatari, you have Russian, you have China that has opened the first ever base outside the country in Djibouti. You have all kinds of interests being used for, you know, basically occupying a terrain that is becoming, for the reasons that Colin just explained, more and more strategic. Africa is going to be the future, whether people like it or not, because demographically speaking, the rest of the planet is aging and Africa is becoming younger. And despite what everybody believed was going to be the future of work, more robots, more automation, more artificial intelligence replacing normal jobs, what we are seeing is a scarcity of manpower. And we are going to probably have to review a bit the way we perceived technological development. We always have this fear that when there is more technology, there will be less jobs. No, the jobs change rather than
we need more skilling. We need upskilling, right? We need
what we have to realize is that Africa represents two absolute musts for the future. The first is that it's going to be the largest consumer market for tech-intensive products and processes, for obvious reasons. You don't expect older people to use tech-intensive gadgets and processes, because that's not appealing to aging. That's appealing to younger population. And then the second reason is because a lot of the tech intensity is related to innovations that, you know, depend on an energy transition that cannot occur without full participation of Africa, and depend also on new forms of mobility that require minerals and extractives that are in largest majority in Africa. So unless we take these as opportunities for the transformation of Africa, at the same time as giving opportunities for Europe, we are going to have a very lip-sided view of what the future may offer. And what I regret is that a lot of the points that were being mentioned by Domenico, for instance, the devil is in the details. If you just take the example of the global gateway, it's 150 billion, but you divide that by the number of years, and you end up the sum being exactly what development aid from Europe and investments from Europe represent nowadays. It's not more. It's more coordination, but it's not more money. And we need a completely different understanding of what we are discussing. It's not methodologies. What we need is real, fresh, greener investments.
Okay, I've heard a number of speakers, a number of you already throwing the gauntlet down to Domenico, and I guess Domenico, but please be brief because I want to get to the next question. So you're on the spot there, but how do you answer these challenges?
I think that well, I can agree with everybody, if I may say, and in the sense that I think all this concern were part of our concern in preparing this summit. And there are two elements. I think first of all, we are fully aware of the fact that we have to develop. And it's not just a question of continental free trade areas, but of course we must have, I would say, corridors to convey the goods from one country to another. But another problem is that we have to industrialize Africa and to provide the continental value chain, because at the moment the intra-Africa trade is one of the lowest in the world, because there is not because there is not a purchase capacity, but because the production is not there. And I think that this is important to move into this production of continental value chain instead of importing from China and from India, because most of the goods are imported from this part. So it's not a question of giving an aesthetic and say, okay, no, we'll do whatever you are going to tell you what you have to do. Continental free trade areas is a political objective, and I think that the Africa should be in the driving seat. Then we can support in all these points where we recognize that there is a problem. Energy. Without energy, there is no economic development. I'm sorry. And of course, for us, it's important that this energy is green, because we committed to decarbonize the whole European economy. That is not a simple matter. I think that we have also resistance from our private sector and so on. And of course, we are in favor of supporting energy production in Africa that is green. For many countries, not even a question of energy transition. It's just a question of starting energy production that could be green. Why we have to go through all the problem that we are now facing in Europe when we started from the fossil fuels?
Right. Okay. Let me move on to Luisa, and let me go to this next question. Why is it that the United Nations do not ask African leaders on transparent and corrupt-free leadership? That is an issue, isn't it? Transparency and corruption in dealing with that for private business to get involved in Africa. What would Business Europe like to see as far as how the summit would deal with that?
Look, I think here we're talking about the conditions. I mentioned this already in my initial intervention, is the condition for people to invest. And of course, one of the conditions is precisely the question of corruption, and the transparency angle is very important. Indeed. And I keep insisting on this, because when we are comparing different development models, when we are comparing a market economy model when we are comparing a state-driven model, we are talking about different things. And I think the EU, we need to be able to sell our own economic and development model. Hopefully the Africans will understand that this is a good model for them too. I'm not saying we should impose it. I think it needs to be accepted as well. But this model is definitely based on more transparency, more engagement, I repeat again, because this is very important, more engagement between the private and the public sector, including in Africa. Okay. And it's not the public sector to say to the private sector what they should do, but it's really a dialogue of equals. And I think this is very important, also to make sure that the companies understand as well that if they have a certain model that is inclusive, that respects rules, that is transparent, they are rewarded and not the opposite. And this is very critical also for the future of this change. As I said, we don't want to keep a model that is only assistance driven and development driven, because this will not help Africa develop also the industrial capacity. And I'll bring a very important point. Today is not only about industry, it's about services. When we export a product, we come also with a service, with people. This is very important. And we have this old traditional way of seeing business that you want to produce goods and you want to export goods. No, we export a service. It comes with a good, it comes with also the service part. And this is what differentiates a given product. So this is very important for the new economic model that we think it's important for the future also in Africa.
And that's what I saw actually when I was doing my homework on this, was that in South Africa, the economy is about 60%, 2/3 services. That to me was a big surprise. That's very interesting, and how much there could be more connections between European companies, including startups, and companies in Africa. I was on the ground. I saw lots of companies where these startups in the service industry, in IT, in apps, and in online sales and apps for mobility, things like that. It's all happening there. If there can be more, and I know there are some companies, some cases where that is happening. It's a European African kind of operation. How much more potential do you see for that, Luisa?
Look, I think on the digital side, it's clear that I think the pandemic created some challenges, but created a lot of opportunities, especially here. So I think also here, one of the main angles is, of course, you need to connect also this digital aspect. And we talk about the digital transformation in Europe is very much conjunction with the digital and green transformation, because what we will need in terms of the industry transformation in Europe is very much connected to how much we can do in terms of services and digitalization. And of course, this is something that in Africa, Africa can go a step further and start already with a solution that brings more digitalization and more green transformation to the way they develop their economy and the way they develop also the industry and the connection with services. So I think definitely here, for the reasons you mentioned, importance of raw materials, having a very young population, this is very critical. The need of skills and the need, and also here, we should be working as well together. So all these can bring really Africa, to jump a lot in the value chain if we manage to work together to develop both the industry and the services with a mind of developing a more sustainable economy and replying to some of the challenges that we have globally on climate change or on digitalization.
Yeah, okay, following on that, Ronak over at Signal Risk, let me ask you about this, because we talked about this, you and I, about the importance of energy as both a risk, but also as an opportunity. And you see a lot of opportunity there for different kinds of energy, like green energy, green hydrogen, right?
Yeah, I think that's true, but there's also got to be a transitionary role for fossil fuels, because and this is the crux of the issue, is that the framing of the debate in Europe and in the West tends to not really take into account the unique circumstances that Africa is facing. And I think there are three issues that fundamentally need to be considered over here. One is the framing. Africa has polluted, has not been responsible for global carbon emissions. We've contributed 2 to 3% of global emissions to date. So we can't play by the same rules as everyone else. Secondly, who's going to finance this? You know, we are constrained. We've got weak balance sheets, and if you're asking us to make this transition, then we're going to need help to finance it. And then the third issue is the issue of fairness. You know, financing fairness and framing of this issue. I think it becomes really important. We do have the ability to grow these industries which are in their infancy, and you know, I think there's no denying that this is the future. But I think it's not really fair to turn around and to say to Africans that are exporting stuff to Europe, these raw materials, and Europeans being the consumers, and then not really being able to mine our economic resources effectively. So I think, you know, understanding that the rules need to be different is important. Yeah. And I think this speaks to, you know, a broader issue. What Africans want is partnership, not paternalism. And I think, you know, we understand what we need to do. We understand that we need to integrate. We're building towards freer markets, continental integration. We want to self-fund our institutions. We want to develop our own capital markets so that we're less reliant on external sources of financing. But I think these are important messages that need to get through, because we're not asking for handouts and charity. We're asking for the ability to develop our own solutions to our problems.
Swazi, can you give us an example of how the African Development Bank, for instance, in South Africa, I know I saw you have a project or maybe more over there in helping Africa to develop its own industrial potential and energy potential, right?
Yes, we do. In fact, our high fives, our famous high fives, are very much focused on the basic requirements for development.
Tell us your high fives. What are those high fives?
So it's Light Up and Power Africa, which talks about energy. You've got Feed Africa, which is agriculture, very important area. We talked about, I think earlier on, food famine. You know, so we're very focused on agriculture. We focused on improving the quality of life of Africans. We are focused on industrializing Africa. That's our other high five. And then the final high five is on integrating Africa. So, I mean, these are all of the, and an assessment was done which showed that they're very much aligned, not only with the SDGs, but also with the Agenda 2063. I always say that, you know, we can talk all we want about a range of issues. I mean, if you talk about, for instance, reform in order to support industrialization, first of all, you know, if you're a European business trying to negotiate appropriate conditions, you know, for your operations in Europe, the terms are different between business and government. You know, compared to what you find in Africa. And I mean, the things that a lot of African businesses are looking for are basic in many respects. You know, they're looking for power, they're looking for reliable power, they're looking for, you know, proper roads where they can, you know, trade with each other. So they're looking for the basic, they're looking for water and sanitation. You know, clean, reliable water. So I insist that any effort at sustainable development must focus on these high five areas. And, you know, this is where we do all of our projects. That's our mandate.
Yeah, give us one. Give us one example.
I talked about desert to power. I talked about desert to power in the Sahel. It's a massive, massive project, multi-year project, but it's life-changing, right? It'll affect 200 million people on the continent. So if you're talking about that 600 million that's not connected to electricity, that is transformational. You know, if you look at road projects, for instance, you talk about the corridors. We've invested in the Nakala corridor, which is very important in Southern Africa, linking a whole range of countries there. We're doing the same thing around food and food security in East Africa. You know, we've got these, we call them SAPZs. They're sort of like these special agro-processing zones. You know, these can develop, and industrialize agriculture, because we do think that it's an important part of Africa's development. So in a range of issues, we're doing all of this. We're building a highway that'll, allow you to drive between Abidjan and Lagos.
Okay.
So given the amount of trade that happens in ECOWAS, these are the sorts of projects that we're interested in.
That free trade area that exists a year now, Colin, you see great potential in that. I remember you told me that you were speaking with Paul Kagame, the leader of Rwanda, and how his economy is only about 10 billion euros. But if you put that into the greater free trade area, what the potential is there, that could be for any country, also South Africa, where you are, right, Colin?
100%. So, effectively, Africa is 54 countries. There are really 3 countries in my mind that are the engines that need to move, which are South Africa, Egypt, and Nigeria. Without those moving, Africa's future looks bleak. So it's important that those countries undertake reforms. But if you're in a Rwanda or a Uganda or one of those countries, when I spoke to President Kagame, I said to him, you have a $10 billion GDP. If you're growing at 10%, GDP per annum, that's wonderful, but you're only adding $1 billion of GDP. That's not going to move the needle sufficiently for your population.
Yeah.
So that the penny really dropped for me, that regional integration and the creation of an effective, efficient market of 1.2 billion people in Africa currently will drive the global multinationals to ask the question, how do we reach them? If you are, let's just use the example, if you are Apple, the world's largest company, and you want to go and manufacture handsets, do you go and export those handsets from the United States, or do you create a manufacturing capacity? Then you've got to ask yourself the question, well, what is the logistics, the transport cost, the labor cost, the tax regime, the incentives, and is there a functional market where I can get up and down to the 1.2 billion people, growing to 4 billion people over the next 80 years? And if your answer is yes, then you're going to build a manufacturing plant. So I think these are critical questions. And in my Yale course that I taught, which was entitled Africa, the Last Frontier of Global Growth, the question of the Africa Free Trade Agreement is pivotal when you do your analysis about doing business in Africa. The pandemic, Chris, was very unfortunate because the pandemic started at the time when the African Free Trade Agreement institutional mechanisms were being put in place.
Yes,
but I've been told by Minister Patel in South Africa and others that process is starting afresh with some momentum. So it's important that at the summit, everything is done by the European Union to help provide whatever support is necessary to get the African Free Trade Agreement. I must just lastly, I think it's both a warning and an acknowledgement. Warn that when Europe speaks to Africa, in the African minds, it's only 50 years ago that Europe was effectively the colonial masters of Africa. And so it's very important that humility from Europe is part of the discussion about governance, about corruption, about all of these things. The role of Belgium in the DRC, where King Leopold effectively personally took control of a whole country.
Yes.
And is very fresh in people's minds. So we need this partnership. We need a good spirit. We have to look forward, but it must be done in that kind of spirit.
I guess maybe, Carlos, let's follow up with you on that, because you used to be head of the UN Economic Commission for Africa. That former colonial powers relationship with Africa, do you see that ending in this summit?
Well, we need, like Colin was just mentioning, modesty, but we also need to acknowledge the fact that we have 6 decades of development aid. During these 6 decades of development aid, Africa continues to be largely dependent on commodity exports. It's about 60% of our trade.
Yeah.
Which means that we have not moved out of the colonial model. where it was commodity exports without value addition. It's very much the way
It's still extractive, right?
Most of Africa continues to work. Not all of it, but most of Africa. So how are we going to change that? I think the Africans are becoming a bit frustrated of making the case that they need the infrastructure, like Swazi was mentioning, that they need more and more investments in terms of industrialization, creating value chains. And when they look into everything that is said, including in the last summit between the two continents and the current one, in terms of the documents that have been prepared for it, they see all the nice words, all the right things in there. But is it really changing? Because the nature of the dialogue cannot be asymmetrical. And right now it's very asymmetrical. Just take this flurry of announcements that always precedes each one of these encounters. And then, there is no mechanism really to make people accountable for what they have promised. And we know that, as I was mentioning at the beginning, the Juncker plan of the last summit has now been forgotten. It has been replaced by something else. So it begs the question, what are we going to put in place to change structurally the economies of the continent?
My apologies about that bell. That's the call to vote here at the European Parliament. Louisa, obviously the interests of companies in Europe are getting resources out of Europe. That's very important. I had a fascinating experience a kilometer underground in South Africa at a platinum mine, where the miners sang Shosholoza, Shosholoza. It was an amazing experience. It did bring home the fact that it is very important for South Africa to export its goods, but also to be able to develop its own industrial potential, so it doesn't have to ship what it pulls out of the ground to Europe to be manufactured. How can European companies help and see that as an opportunity to develop in Africa? Louisa.
Well, I think we all want to have a relationship that is more equal, and Africa doesn't want to be lectured by Europe on what to do.
Of course not.
And I think also when we say we need to invest more in Africa, we need to industrialize more. Yes, but this needs also to be a decision from Africa, from the Africa private sector. Where is the African private sector? I mean, they have an important role to play. And this is something that it's very important, because if it's easier for a big multinational company to go to Africa and mitigate some of the risks that still exist, because let's be clear, we have conflict issues, we have all the problems related to infrastructure and access to energy. But what about if I'm not a multinational? And actually, right, this non-multinational economy is the driving of Europe's development, and it should be the driver of Africa's development. So I think we need to ensure that we really make the conditions right for the middle, as the Germans call the Mittelstand. So the small and medium-sized enterprises to have the conditions to grow in Africa, together with Europeans, of course. But I think it's very important that we don't always think about multinationals, because that is a model that it's not the one will take Africa to the next stage. So we are ready to do it. But for this to happen, of course, if we want to attract a different kind of companies as well to invest in Africa, we definitely need to look at risk factors, because it's not the same for a big company or a smaller company to invest under these conditions. And this is something where governments and the private sector, together with financial institutions, can help.
I guess I have less than 3 minutes left, and I would like to get a couple of final quick comments. Domenico, I got to go to you very quickly. We've got these roundtables going on at that summit. It seems like it's more of a concrete approach to solutions. Can you give us 2 concrete solutions you hope to see out of this 2-day summit? Quickly.
Well, 2 solutions. I think that the investment package that will present a number of flagship initiatives that should take place in the next 12-24 months is the best example of that we wanted to move into something concrete that is responding to African initiative. For instance, just to mention something for the South Africa, there is this Just Energy Transition Alliance that should help the country to move from the fossil fuel energy production into something greener. And I think that this is one of the best examples that we can propose, for instance, for South Africa.
Very good. Let me cut you off there because I've got to move on. Ronak, give us one solution you'd like to see come out of this summit.
Well, I mean, look, there are a lot of solutions. I think that the lowest hanging fruit is in terms of the IMF SDRs and the reallocation. Africa is asking for 100 billion of that, and I think if Europe is serious about showing goodwill, about demonstrating something that can have a very real, meaningful, and instant impact, and repairing what is quite a fractured relationship, I think this is the obvious low-hanging fruit. But I think there's a broader issue around values over here, because there is a compelling alternative, the Washington consensus, and to the European model and Western model in the Beijing consensus, which is becoming far more attractive. So I think, that's something that Europe is going to need to reconcile going forward.
Okay, I wanted to hit on that. And good, Swazi, very quickly, one solution you want to see come out of this summit?
Yeah, I mean, I honestly hope that, the plans for implementing whatever the resolutions are based on existing pathways for doing that. Because creating new institutions, creating new frameworks, and all of that takes time and usually leads to nothing.
Okay.
So I'm really hoping that we have an international financial architecture. It exists. It is built. It is ready to deliver. Use that.
Yep, absolutely. Thanks to all of you, all the speakers, all of you watching. This was very engaging, very quick. And I think we covered a lot of ground. Thank you so much for watching this debate, Euronews Africa News online debate on the EU-Africa Summit, the South African perspective. And please keep in mind the hashtag EU-AU Summit, hashtag Africa News Debates, hashtag Euronews Debates. We hope to hear from you. My name is Chris Burns. Thanks for watching. See you next time.